America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. How do our desires shape our prosperity? Hello, I'm Rob Melso. Welcome to episode 19 of the Liberty Brief Podcast. Today we'll be looking at Chapter 12 of Dr. Tom Giordano's book, Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters. In this chapter, Dr. Tom recounts his father's lesson to him on a fundamental principle of free market interactions and how pursuing our own private self-interests led to the betterment of society as a whole. Now, why should you care? Well, according to Newsweek, one study of 71 four-year American universities claims that 24% of respondents had a positive view of capitalism, compared to the 32% who had a positive view of socialism. Well, my thinking is that something's very wrong there. And I'd say that if we don't get our younger kids informed on economics and the history of failure of communism and socialism, they'll be headed for an easy slaughter here in the United States. Basically, our country will cease to exist. Right after World War II, we saw on full display the scourge of socialism and its horrific effect. We all believed it to be discredited and finally dead. Not today, though. If our college-age kids think socialism is a preferred economic system, then they just don't understand history, nor what it is that drives successful economies, and why socialistic or communistic ideas aimed at controlling the means of production, the division of labor, price controls, interest rates, and so forth, all the well-known government interventions into the markets, why they all wind up failing, for all their supposed good intentions. Well, we're going to dive into these ideas and a few more. So with that, let's say hello to Dr. Tom and get on our way.
Hey, Rob. Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Chapter 12 in the book was a lesson my father gave me when I was about 16 years old, and it was a real eye-opener. I'm still not sure what prompted the discussion, but I think I brought up something about wealthy people giving back something to society in thanks for their success and prosperity. As I recall, my father told me it was a nice charitable gesture, but hardly necessary. Although he did recognize the importance and the contributions of what he referred to as enlightened self-interest, this was not the lesson he wanted me to understand. This would come in later discussions on the dividing line between social responsibilities and government meddling into society where it has no business. It was an interesting lesson that he gave.
All right, so let's begin. One of the things that I liked most about your father was that he defined words and ideas in simple terms. So perhaps we should first define socialism, communism. What's the difference?
Well, here's the important thing to remember. And I'm going to explain this like I'm talking to a 10-year-old. Okay.
That should fit me well.
Okay. Communism and socialism are both the spawn of Marxism. In other words, they both came out of Marxist thought. They are theories about how society should be organized, but they have some important differences. Communism is the idea that everyone should share everything equally and that the government should own and control everything. The system professes equality of outcome, no matter how miserable that outcome is, and regardless of the human costs. Socialism is also an idea that everyone should share things more equally, but it's not as extreme as communism. Socialism means that the government would control some things like healthcare, education, and some industries to distribute resources by capricious means according to the value an individual has to the state. So in simple terms, communism is the government being in charge of everything, and socialism is the government being in charge of some things, but not all. Neither of these ideas are economic, and I have to stress that. They are ways to organize societies, all right? Economics is only incorporated to wage that control over people. In deference, Capitalism, which is their derogatory term for free market enterprise, is an economic system of investments into the means of production. Capitalism exists under every political system, including communism, socialism, or any other name they wish to use. The only difference is where the money comes from, where it is invested, and who gets the profits.
Okay, I was just thinking about a conversation I had online a few years back where someone was pointing out the inherent inhumanity of capitalism. He was so dead set against capitalism. I asked him at one point if he was a communist, and he said yes. It was lost on him, I'm sure, that communism is responsible for the death or starvation of over 100 million of their own people. So I hardly think students would condone that if they really understood the history of this reprehensible ideology. And I don't think kids today are receiving an adequate education regarding the true nature of free markets and our political system, as envisioned by the founders.
Yes, well, the inherent inhumanity of capitalism. Where is the inhumanity in voluntary interactions between people following their own free will and private personal interests in the absence of coercion? Where is the inhumanity in investing in commodities to increase productivity and efficiency and wages for the working man? How about better workplace environments? It seems these people have never heard of gulags and concentration camps.
Well, I suppose not, but, he's pointing to the old standard assertion that big, greedy corporations profit while the rest of us are unwitting slaves to them working for meager wages.
Well, I think they have to make up their minds. Slaves aren't paid a wage. Their labor is stolen from them with a threat of violence, not with a threat of a wage. And wage earners can walk away from their jobs anytime they wish and look for higher wages somewhere else. I never saw any Ford assembly line workers laboring under gunpoint. Have you? I think Milton Friedman would likely respond that while capitalism is not perfect, and it's not, it is still the most effective system to produce widespread economic growth and prosperity. It's brought billions of people out of poverty. I think he would argue that any perceived unfairness in capitalism is the result of government intervention, not the inherent nature of the system as it is with Marxism and Marxist thought. He would likely urge us to look for ways to improve the system rather than simply denouncing it as inherently unfair. As far as greed goes, which of us isn't greedy? It's always the other guy that's greedy. You know what I mean? Big corporations do not inherently act upon greed. They act upon self-interests. And the first is producing their products and services in an efficient manner. And the second is maximizing a return on the investments for their stockholders. He would also argue that the profit motive can be a powerful force for good in the economy, and that the size of a corporation does not necessarily make it more or less prone to greed. You would expect them to try and protect their interests. It is the government bending to those interests that incentivizes them to act unethically. And if people think that there's no greed in a communist country or in a socialist country, they should really think again. Because greed preexists capitalism. There was greed on this planet much before there was capitalism.
Dr. Tom, one of the things I liked most about your father was his ability to make hard subjects easy to understand. I especially liked how he simplified the concept of economy, quote unquote. Before we get into free markets and all of that, let's just take a brief step back and try to define the word economy as your father did for you when you were 8 years old.
The word itself is a compound word from the Greek oikos and nemein. All right. Oikos means house and nemein means to manage. Combined, it basically means household management or controlling your home. Simple, right? Simple concept. Now, the word is simply defined for our terms as the judicious use of wealth and resources. This definition encompasses many other concepts, such as assets and liabilities, profits and losses, and satisfying missions or objectives, which underline the foundations for judicious decision-making. Okay, so in order to have an economy, you have to have a mission.
I wonder how many people could have stated this as simply as your father did. All right, Dr. Tom, let's get to it. You named your chapter 12, Human Desire, Human Choice, Human Action. Why is that?
Well, because my father explained to me many years before, I think I was about 8 or 9, that economies were not necessarily based upon the flow of money between people, but more upon the desires of people pursuing their own interests and the choices they make to act upon those interests. More to the point, however, this chapter deals with Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand in showing how any activity we pursue has benefits to society that are unforeseen and, for the most part, unsung. They're just not apparent.
So my predilection for buying good scotch is helping the economy.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Well, you're referring to what they call positive externalities in economics.
Yes. Effects upon society in which mostly everyone had no involvement in the decisions and activities which gave rise to positive changes in society or in the economy. That's a positive externality.
Well, I feel positive after drinking it.
Or you feel nothing after drinking too much of it.
Okay. For our listeners, tell us who Adam Smith was.
Okay, sure. The brief answer is that Adam Smith was an 18th century Scottish economist. He was a philosopher and an author. He offered a unique insight into the fledgling science of political economy. And he was a pivotal figure in the Scottish Enlightenment. He wrote 2 books that were very well accepted and well read, entitled The Theory of Moral Sentiments and An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, usually just abbreviated the Wealth of Nations. Today, very few would question that his second book is the first modern work on economics. For this reason, he's regarded as the father of modern economics. Some detractors call him the father of capitalism. But I don't look at that as a detraction. The idea of the invisible hand appears in this second book, which he published in 1776, a prophetic year for us.
Right. How was Adam Smith positioned to think about the economics of his day?
Well, the first thing to remember is that economics had been examined from the beginning of Western civilization. I mean, even the Greeks looked at it. But however, I think that we can say that the first investigations into what we would call modern economics probably started at the Universidad de Salamanca in Spain in the 1600s. The first investigators into pricing and free trade were actually moral theologians trained in the tradition of St. Thomas Aquinas and not economists. They were later known as the late scholastics. These Spanish thinkers were very pro-free market. Today, we associate their ideas, those earlier ideas, with the Scottish tradition. But this came into the general picture much later. Also, Smith was observing the economic concepts that were flying around in France and disseminated by the so-called physiocrats. All right, this group organized themselves around 1770, and their premise was that all wealth came from nature, particularly agriculture. Our Dr. Benjamin Franklin was inducted into this group for his writings on the folly of Great Britain interfering with the transatlantic trade with the colonies. So, in effect, Adam Smith's observations on human interactions coincided with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. He was at the right place at the right time for his ideas to be implemented, though he passed away in 1790. He didn't see them implemented, let's put it that way.
Okay, well, maybe we can explain in more detail the idea of, quote, the invisible hand, unquote. By the way, my mother had one, and it usually wound up smacking the back of my head when I deserved it.
My mother used a wooden spoon. She didn't want to hurt her hand.
Well, all she had to do was open up the utensil drawer and we knew we were in trouble.
Oh, yeah. That's what we heard. We heard those. and my older brother and I we hid under the covers. Okay. The invisible hand is a metaphor that Smith used to describe the self-regulating mechanism of the market economy by which activities following the self-interests of individuals in the marketplace can lead to unintended benefits to society as a whole. The underlying observation he makes is that when individuals pursue their own self-interests, they will naturally seek to get goods and services at the lowest possible cost and sell them at the highest possible price. By doing this, they will drive down the costs of goods and services for others and increase the productivity and wealth of society. In other words, by people pursuing their own self-interests, individuals are led unknowingly, as if by an invisible hand, to promote the general welfare of society. This gives us a whole different meaning to what the founders meant by that term, promote the general welfare, in our Constitution. It comes from Smith's writings on the invisible hand. This was the basis of their argument that the government should not interfere in the economy, as the invisible hand would better guide the economy towards optimal outcomes.
So you're saying that Smith's ideas on economics and government had a significant influence on the founding fathers of the United States. How can we be so sure?
Well, as I said, The Wealth of Nations was widely read by the founding fathers. The idea that individuals pursuing their own self-interests can lead to a betterment of society as a whole lined up perfectly with the principles of individual rights and limited government that were central to the American Revolution. Later, with the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, it provided them with a framework for understanding of how a nation's economy could be organized and how economic growth could be promoted. We see this reflected in the General Welfare Clause. Smith's ideas on free trade, the division of labor, and the role of government in the economy influenced American economic policy from the beginning of our republic.
Well, from what I recall, when I studied economics at university, didn't Smith himself recognize that the invisible hand does not always lead to optimal outcomes and that government intervention may be necessary in certain circumstances, such as to correct market failures or to promote the public good?
Yes, that's true. That's true. But you have to establish a couple of things. The first is that he was surrounded by a feudal system and government-run monopolies. They were the norm for certain industries. The king and his advisors ran the show, okay? He understood that the market economy is not perfect and that there are certain circumstances where government intervention may be necessary to promote the public good and correct market failures. The second, I think you'll find, is that what he is referring to as market failures occurs when the precepts of the invisible hand are violated. They are always linked in some way to the immoral activities of individuals, such as not respecting property rights or contracts, like we talked about in the episode dealing with pollution, okay, or impeding fair competition, all right, or tortious interference with competitors' businesses. The invisible hand is predicated upon voluntary interactions between people who are fully informed about what they stand to obtain from the deal. Deception, omission of facts, misleading promises merely promote theft. They don't promote the invisible hand. In some cases, such as with monopolies, cartels and collusions, let's say, you may find that in every instance, there is a government promoting them or turning a blind eye to their activities.
Well, I think I can understand that. So since we can't be certain of individual morality, which government interventions was Smith referring to?
Well, he identified several specific areas where government interventions may be necessary. By the way, every one of them were adopted as the ordinary roles of government in a free society. The founders spelled them out not only in the Declaration of Independence, but in the U.S. Constitution as well.
You're referring to the basic functions of our government, right?
Yes.
We went over the three functions in previous episodes. If I remember them, they were to wage war against foreign aggression. The second one was to wage peace through policing and the court systems, and to maintain a level playing field for commerce. See, I take notes.
That's good. Yes, that's right. And the government at all levels, especially the federal government, was to do this through tariffs and import duties, rents and leases, and the issuance of bonds at interest. Taxation was only to be decided upon in times of war for the common defense, and only for limited time frames covering the crisis. This all changed with the 16th Amendment, as we went over in a previous episode.
Yes, I remember the 16th Amendment, and so does my accountant.
Yeah.
All right, so what else? Were there specifics that Smith talked about?
Yes, about 5 things. Now, remember, Smith advocated for a limited government in all the aspects of the lives of the people. But he recognized that the primary functions of government had to be addressed, and that some of the goods and services related to those functions could not be provided by the market. Things like an army and a navy for the national defense and infrastructure. Another thing that had to be provided by the government was protecting property rights and enforcing contracts through a strong legal system. He also thought that the government should regulate monopolies to combat higher prices and reduced output. And he also thought that the government had a role in addressing externalities which impose costs upon third parties who do not participate in the decision-making process. As I said, he believed that government intervention may be necessary to address these externalities, such as by taxing or regulating activities that generate negative externalities or subsidizing activities that generate positive externalities. All right. Lastly, he thought that the government should address market failures caused by incomplete information. Smith recognized that when individuals don't have access to truthful information, they need to make informed decisions, such as, by a lack of transparency, markets fail. He believed that the government has a role in providing consumers with information about the products they buy. Now, you may notice that of these 5 things, most of them are already incorporated in what our founding fathers put into the Constitution. All right. So I think some of these concepts can be questioned, like controlling monopolies, which he understood as government-controlled monopolies. But I think it is important to note that his ideas on government intervention were extremely limited. He surely was an advocate for a minimal role of government. Intervention in the economy, then, is only justified when it is necessary to promote the public good and correct market failures caused by corrupt individuals or natural catastrophes.
Well, once again, we have to assume, and I don't know that we can always assume this nowadays, that those in government are virtuous and acting morally. And we also rely on an educated and virtuous electorate. These are 2 things that sometimes
absolutely
are in question.
Smith's ideas on government intervention in the economy are based on the assumption that government officials are acting in the best interest of society, and that they have the knowledge and the ability to make well-informed decisions about when and how to intervene. But we all know that this assumption rarely holds true in practice, especially today. Government officials usually don't act in the best interest of the general society. But, in their own specific self-interests or invested political interests of a group or a pack contrary to the welfare of society. But even if lawmakers are acting in the interests of the general population, they rarely have access to the information and expertise they need to make well-informed decisions about, economic policy. Look at all the failures they've had. Look at all the experts that were wrong. Okay. So whatever the decision is and whatever the true intention behind it, it is also important to consider the potential trade-offs and unintended consequences of government intervention in the economy.
Well, and therein lies the reason our federal government was designed with trying to ensure checks and balances, transparency, and accountability in government. Government officials were supposed to be held accountable for their actions, that they were acting in the public interest. I wonder where those ideas have gone. You know, Dr. Tom, it's always amazed me how business people will tout the benefits of free markets and competition for lowering prices and increasing quality for the consumers at the Chamber of Commerce lunches. But they're the first ones to form some kind of political action committee to protect their own industries and stifle competition. It seems to me that these ideas go out the window when they're talking about their own interests.
Well, if you're asking me if political action committees and de facto monopolies violate the idea of the invisible hand, they certainly do. PACs raise and spend money to influence political campaigns and give certain groups or individuals a disproportionate influence over the political process. This can create a bias in the political system that violates the idea of the invisible hand by creating barriers to competition and limiting the ability of individuals to pursue their own self-interest on an even playing field. You know, society as a whole is damaged. This is not what the free market is supposed to be. The same can be said for real or de facto monopolies where a single company or a small group of companies control a large share of the market. It will always lead to higher prices, reduced output, and reduced innovation. But don't even get me started on professional licensing boards and professional associations. You want to talk about protecting a group's self-interests. All you have to do is look at any professional licensing board.
All right. Well, let's get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of how the metaphor of the invisible hand works. In your book, in chapter 12, I was reading about your father, Buster. He gave your friend Frank's father, Dr. Pettinelli, as an example. I remember his medical office on 9th and Reed Streets in South Philly. But what your father explained was pretty elaborate. He concentrated on the nails and all of the commercial interactions involved to mine the ores. You know, the machines and hand tools made in factories, human labor, all of the industries involved in creating the means of transportation, so on. He was pretty clear in describing supply chains and higher orders of production. To simplify things, I remember that Dr. Milton Friedman had an illustration of Smith's invisible hand. Do you remember that?
Sure. Dr. Friedman wrote an essay which he called I Pencil, which is a perfect and simple illustration of the idea. The essay tells the story of a pencil and describes how it is made and how one individual could not have made it. He highlights that the raw material parts and other components, their sources, such as wood from the northwest of the U.S., graphite and brass from South America, rubber for the eraser from Southeast Asia, and so on, are all part of a complex process and interaction between many people. The point of the essay is to demonstrate how the invisible hand of the market brings together many individuals and resources needed to produce a simple thing like a pencil without the need of central planning or coordination. Now think about it. Millions of people are involved. They speak different languages. They have different religions. They have absolutely no idea where their labors are directed. They have no idea that mining tin and copper in Antofagasta in Chile is going to wind up being fused into brass to make a ring that's going to hold an eraser on the top of a pencil in the United States. It shows how the market coordinates the actions of millions of individuals and resources, each pursuing their own self-interest to produce goods and services that improve our lives, and is a self-regulating system that is more efficient and effective than any alternative. It's really, really an interesting insight into how things work. And on top of it, you get the pencil for a nickel. If you were to try to combine travel to all these places and get all the individual parts to put together a pencil, it would cost you tens of thousands of dollars. But we can go out to the store and buy as much as we want for a nickel apiece.
Well, I've got a new appreciation for the pencil that's in my hand right now. But, while sitting to myself and thinking about this sort of thing, I've done some soul searching, and perhaps you could call them mind experiments, looking at some product and trying to imagine all of the interplay between people. I've thought about supermarkets, the thousands of items that are on the shelves, how they're all coordinated, and they make it to that shelf without any central planning. Going from raw materials to refined products, which then become inserted into the supply chain to be used in producing perhaps other goods and so on. In my own business, I had to do these kinds of sourcings while keeping an eye on market price fluctuations. The more you look at it, the more complex it becomes.
Yes. And the complexity is so great that I would challenge anybody to try to write it down, let alone control it. And it is self-regulating, just like the laws of nature. It is subject to the laws of supply and demand, which are often viewed as natural laws of the market. These laws help to determine the price and the quantity of goods and services that are produced and consumed in the economy. However, it is important to note that the economy is not a perfect system, precisely because of the nature of people. Many things related to human activities can influence the functioning of the market, such as cultural, social, political, and environmental factors.
Dr. Tom, early in my business career, I realized that economics can be considered a means of communication regarding prices and higher orders of production and supply chains. Prices are one of the key mechanisms by which the economy communicates information about the relative scarcity of goods and services and the preferences of the consumers. You could say that they provide signals to producers about what goods and services to produce, how much to produce, how to produce them, so on. They can also provide signals to consumers about what goods and services to buy and how much to buy.
Yes, that's all true. In addition, the study of economics also provides a framework for understanding the complex relationships that exist between different levels of production and supply chains, including the allocation of resources, the division of labor, and the coordination of activities. For example, the study of microeconomics provides insights into how individual firms and consumers make decisions, while the study of macroeconomics provides insights into how economies as a whole function. That's why they're divided into different subspecializations, let's say. They also provide channels for examining how different market structures, such as perfect competition, monopolies, and oligopolies, can affect the functioning of the economy, as well as how government policies, such as taxes, subsidies, and regulations, can affect economic outcomes.
You've made the statement before that markets don't fail, people do. Isn't that statement supported by the idea of the invisible hand being interfered with by immoral self-interests of groups or governments?
Yes, that's right. The statement, markets don't fail, people do, suggests that the markets are inherently efficient and self-regulating, but they can be disrupted by the actions of individuals or groups with immoral self-interests. This idea aligns with Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand perfectly.
Let me ask you a question, Dr. Time. Is it possible for anyone to have enough information to exert total control over the means of production? such as under a communist or socialist model of economics? I think I know the answer to this one, by the way.
No, it is extremely unlikely that anyone would have enough information to exert total control over the means of production as under communist and socialist models of economics. All right, that's been amply proved. Okay, there's no need to even think about it. The economy is a highly complex and dynamic system with a vast amount of information that would need to be taken into account to make decisions about how resources are allocated and what goods and services are to be produced. A communist or socialist model of economics is based on the idea that the government or a collective entity should own and control the means of production. However, it is difficult for any central authority to have access to all the information that is needed to make informed decisions. Furthermore, the complexity of the economy is such that even if an entity had access to all the information, it would be extremely difficult for them to process it and act upon it in a timely and effective manner. But I think that the most immediate cause of all their failures in the past has been precisely because their model discourages and discounts individual self-interest. That is, human desires, human choices, and human actions. It interferes with what people want.
It's hard for me to see how anyone who knows anything about history can deny that following free voluntary exchanges between people has led to such economic prosperity. It seems to me that the history of economic prosperity is completely dependent on the emergence and growth of market economies, which are characterized by voluntary exchange of goods and services between individuals and businesses. I mean to say that the idea of voluntary exchange, which is a cornerstone of a market economy, has been shown to be an efficient and effective way of allocating resources and generating economic growth. You know, when individuals and businesses are free to buy and sell goods and services as they see fit, they're able to pursue their own self-interest and respond to the changing preferences of consumers. This leads to the production of goods and services that are in higher demand and the efficient use of resources.
Exactly. Historically, countries that have adopted, market-oriented economic policies and have protected property rights, contracts, and the freedom to trade have experienced higher rates of economic growth and prosperity than countries that have adopted more centrally planned or controlled economic systems. It's obvious.
Dr. Tom, in the beginning of this episode, you spoke of, quote, enlightened self-interest, end quote, and said that your father considered it, again, I'm quoting, hardly necessary for people to, quote again, give back to society. That's one of the main reasons usually given for people who want a more socialistic government. You know, the idea that the rich must pay their fair share. Why did he believe that that wasn't necessary?
Well, because if we understand fully the idea of Smith's invisible hand, we are already giving back to society and to the economy just by following our own activities. By engaging ourselves in any action, we are effecting an ever-expanding movement of products, services, occupational activities, and so on. We don't even have to think about it. We all enrich each other. It's not a zero-sum game. You know, this is not to say that charitable people should refrain from identifying needs in society and addressing them with their talents and with their money. This is a very important aspect of free societies, especially if we want to keep forced government redistribution at bay. In fact, this is what made America the greatest nation this world has ever seen. What it means is that people should not feel any guilt about being more successful than others in our society. It also means that there can be no argument that those socialistic-minded people around us that believe that they're entitled to something that doesn't belong to them. I think we should all keep the last statement in mind before we go about listening to politicians and bureaucrats telling us just how unjust our country is. It's not unjust at all.
Dr. Tom, as I look at socialist-run countries, when it comes to giving to less fortunate countries, for example, when there's a drought or a famine or an earthquake or some other humanitarian crisis, no country in the world today even comes close to matching United States aid. And individually, Americans are the most giving people on the planet to churches, communities, and to other charities. Now, why is that? I believe it's because Americans don't yet know what citizens in socialist countries have already come to realize. Those citizens know that their government will decide who gets their money, and their government will do the allocation for them, instead of letting them decide to give as their individual wants see fit. That is until the socialist governments all eventually go bankrupt. So in the meantime, no need to pony up if we're in a socialist-run country.
Right, exactly.
Well, I have to say there's an invisible second hand on my watch, but the minute hand is telling me that we should end this podcast.
Okay.
So I want to thank you again, Dr. Tom, for another great discussion. The next podcast will be on boom and bust cycles, how they come about and what we need to do about them. So until then, I want to thank you again, Dr. Tom, and we will see you next time. You've been listening to The Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.